Section with you in Department of Political Science. So I must first begin by thanking Professor Richard Price. He's the one who did all the paperwork to get me here for a year. And of course, Professor Alan Jacobs has taken over since then. Seamlessly hand-holding continues. And where to find me? I sit in the room where Ben sits. Not only he is helping me with being visible online, he's also allowing me space in his room to use a desk. That's where I am off and on when I come to the department. Must also thank Adam, who's another person who's embedded me in the system there. And of course, Michael. I had been familiar with his name, but I found him very accessible and thank you for inviting me to deliver this talk. And of course, Brian Jacobs is another well-known name in Asia. I'm delighted he chose to spare his morning to be here with us. And thank you, everybody. And I think let me begin by first of all attracting your attention to see where are these countries that we are talking about, because you're familiar, but just to take you away from the last tweet you were looking at to something that we are going to discuss now. So locating where they are is the first thing we need to do. And I literally thought if you were standing on a huge map on Canada and looking east, this is where you will kind of look at the map of these two countries being located, in that sense, in the far east side of the map, if you look from Canada. And zoom in a little bit, and you notice that there are several other countries in the neighborhood. Russia, there's several other smaller, bigger countries around there. That gives you a little sense of where are these two countries fundamentally located, and we will have a little bit discussion. Another thing that makes them very visible is their population. They are enormously large-sized countries in that sense. China, by the last count, and it keeps changing because in India we say we are producing almost, let me say China and India every day produce children of the same number as UBC's total count is. So it's a population increasing constantly. So that's why the last count was 1.38 billion people in China, 1.37 billion, but UN Department of Population came out with a report saying in November, India will actually cross China and become largest country in terms of population on the planet. And they would together form roughly around 35–36% of the entire planet. So sometimes we say if these two countries are able to take care of their own people, then bulk of the global population is taken care of in that sense. So whatever they do domestically itself has enormous impact on how the world will be living together. Consumption is something that is enormously rising in these two countries, and that is showing impact world over. But what is essential about their relationship is what we are discussing. Remember, Michael immediately came back and said, oh, essential could mean different things. So I was reminded of a poet prime minister who's also a great mentor of the current prime minister of India. His name is Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He was the man who announced that India had finally detonated nuclear weapons in 1998. Now, he made something very popular. He used to often say, you can choose friends, but you cannot choose neighbors. That means engaging China for India is not a matter of choice. You have no options but to choose engaging China. And therefore, this part of the essential would mean like it is inevitable to deal with China. But that is not something that we want to focus on. We want to focus on essential in terms of what is quintessential nature of the relationship. What is the stereotypical way people look at these two countries engaging with each other. And I lay out very quickly some of the premises that I want to share with you as to how that relationship in terms of its core quintessential nature looks like. Both are ancient civilizations and continuing ancient civilizations, not that they at any stage disappeared. Now that means that they have enormous baggage of knowing each other historically and interacting with each other historically, which makes semantics and symbols extremely significant in the relationship. They're very sensitive to semantics and symbols. And sometimes that is not really understood by a sort of, let's say, person who is from another culture or another part of the world. But at the same time, with this baggage of, let's say, about 5,000 years written history, they are also increasingly driven now with their future ambitions or future needs. For example, exponential growth of energy consumption. And both are extremely dependent on importing energy. And you can see how they are relating to the Ukraine crisis driven by that. So while there is an enormous baggage of history, there is also baggage or pressure of expectations about future. Both, as I just mentioned, are largest populations, but invariably the trends there are driven by sometimes just a single individual. Very often in Indian case, Prime Minister, and in Chinese case, whosoever is the General Secretary or the paramount leader. So Mao, for example, was in command for almost 4 decades, followed by Deng Xiaoping for 2 decades, then Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao for 1 decade each, and now Xi Jinping is trying to cross beyond 1 decade and stay longer. Same in India, first Prime Minister for 17 years, we had another Prime Minister, his daughter for 14 years, we had another leader for 10 years, the current leader is already elected for 10 years, he might continue longer. So that kind of binary of large populations, but ultimately very few people who determine the future of these nations. Both are also extremely self-conscious and very proud of their own politics, culture, society, rituals, food, everything. But invariably overcast by structural factors that are beyond their control, are outside, exogenous structural factors. And the fact that they are nation states is itself a contradiction. They were not historically nation states. They had frontiers, not borders. So what they are is an imposition or acceptance of European culture, of nation state, which is territorial nation state. And then, of course, all their problems are very often related to the colonial experience, the Cold War legacies, where China was initially very close to Russia, and then, of course, it moved to United States. It is back again now moving towards Russia. India does exactly opposite. It was initially close to United States. Eisenhower had a role in Indian independence, and then, of course, moved to Soviet Union, and now again moving to United States. So those legacies are also enormously, inordinately impacting the relationship. They have by now also learned how to deal with their historical and bilateral irritants or issues. And by the time they manage to do that, they are now getting into a domain where there are a whole lot of new problems for them, which are driven by the current and future trends, especially the fact that they're both emerging rapidly. That creates new ambitions, new needs, and new irritations. Then, of course, they also have enormous irritations of, for example, India is very sensitive to China-Pakistan nexus or axis or whatever, or the nuclear defense cooperation. So Pakistan was originally part of India, and then, of course, it partitioned, and it has suddenly become the best, most allied ally of China. India, on the other hand, has about, by the very conservative count, 100,000 Tibetans, which are refugees in India. But most important, His Holiness Dalai Lama is in India. Even when the fact that I always say Buddha was born in Nepal, Buddhism was born in India, and now the largest Buddhist country is China. So that link of Tibetans being in India is again something that is very sensitive to Chinese. So these are again constant reflections. So fundamentally, how I define the quintessential nature of the relationship, I call it a mosaic. A mosaic which includes everything. Is a constantly happening cooperation, coordination, contestation, confrontation, and conflict. So they all coexist. Only thing interesting is that on monthly or yearly basis, you can see the flair or the flavor which is the dominant color in the mosaic. That keeps changing, and that is where the relationship has to be managed between the two sides. Now, what is the current flavor? Very quickly, if one has to run through history of 75 years, both when they became newly independent were overambitious, utopian visions. They wanted to change the world, make it nice. So there's a Hindi expression which says Chinese and Indians are brothers. That was a popular slogan of 1950s. Chinese Prime Minister Chou Enlai and Indian Prime Minister Nehru, they were very, very close friends, and they would have long conversations, hours and hours, sit together, almost like family. And then, of course, they got into tension. When both started demarcating their boundaries, they felt that other side was claiming something more than they deserved. And it all ended then into a border war in 1962. And for a decade or more, they were virtually not on talking terms with each other. And interesting it is that this is also a period of cultural revolution in China, which is leading to enormous radicalization of foreign policy, which again explains the kind of close engagement China during that period develops with Pakistan. Then we move to the next new phase of 1988. We had a young prime minister. This was a meeting between Deng Xiaoping and Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Deng Xiaoping was 84 and Indian Prime Minister 48 at that time, and they had a long handshake, which became very symbolic of a new chapter opening in the relationship, which is usually called a chapter of peace and tranquility. Basically saying that the border is disputed, yes, but let that dispute not stop us from engaging in other areas. So, for example, trade became an important area where both countries started engaging each other and continue to engage with each other. But then we move now into China really claiming its space on the planet, and India is also trying to make sure that it is not pushed to the wall with this rising China. And we had a border skirmish in a place called Galwan. I don't know if you heard that. India has announced the number of soldiers who died there, about 20 soldiers died. China has not announced any number. But since then, we are back to saying, Indian foreign minister has made several speeches to say normalization on border would determine the normalization on bilateral relations. So we are back again to where we were in 1988 in that sense. But of course, this is no longer 1988. We are in a very different world now. We'll talk about it very quickly. So if you were to look at the map, this is how I intentionally use that flame color to underline the tension. And then one area on this side, my side of the map, is area called Jammu and Kashmir. If you heard that, Jammu and Kashmir is a province of India, but is partly administered or controlled by China and Pakistan. Sometimes there's also an impression that Kashmir is an India-Pakistan problem, but that province is actually occupied by both China and Pakistan. So it's a huge area in conflict, and this becomes particularly significant given the China-Pakistan nexus or axis. They are together in this area. And on the east of the map, also you see there is another large area which is about 90,000 square kilometers. I know Canada is a huge country, so 90,000 doesn't mean anything to you. But together the conflict involves about 132,000 square kilometers. You could say it is 2/3 of a country called Nepal that you see in the middle. That is the kind of conflict. So I always say it's a territorial sovereignty dispute. It's not a border dispute. Border dispute will be really misunderstanding the whole thing. Now, if you look at only China, India, then the yellow color will tell you the areas which are occupied by China and are in dispute with India. You can see the line, red line shows the disputed border, which is line of actual control. And the yellow color territories are territories in dispute. This is how the province of Jammu and Kashmir looks like. The green color is the area which is occupied by Pakistan, and red color is the one which is occupied by China, and blue color is still controlled by India. Now, what is interesting is that when Pakistan talks about Kashmir, they only talk of that western strip that is what is called Kashmir according to Pakistan. So they like to call it Azad Kashmir, which is a misnomer because it's a territory that belongs to India. The big chunk on the north, which is green, is already taken over by Pakistan. And it is directly controlled by usually a major general from or a joint secretary from Islamabad. And that's a huge territory which is not even recognized by Pakistan as Kashmir. So basically, let's go back to China, which is the red color area, which is where the problem is. And this is the other eastern sector, 90,000 square kilometers. In about 10 seconds, I also wish to underline these are areas in Himalayas. So these are not areas where you can easily even access these areas. More important, these are not areas where you have villages or people or habitation, where you have history as to whose cows were grazing here and who was collecting the taxes. There is no such history to support as to who was actually in control of these regions since ancient times when they were actually dealing with each other. So what have they done to address this most fundamental problem that determines the nature of or the essential nature of China-India relations? They've been virtually talking to each other on this issue for half a century. It began with a very interesting episode. After that India-China war, they were not on talking terms until Marshal Tito died and there was a funeral in Yugoslavia, which is where Indian Prime Minister and Chinese Premier was there, and they happened to bump into each other and say hello to each other. And that opened up first mid-ranking official level talks with each other, that they would begin to see what they can do in terms of resolving issues. But more important, they opened trade relationships, very minuscule, but they opened the trade relationship 2 years later in 1984. That is the visit of 1988 that I was mentioning, where a young Indian Prime Minister went and met Deng Xiaoping and said, let's open a new chapter in the relationship. They set up a boundary, intergovernmental boundary, a working group on boundary issue, which became a kind of a generic forum where they started discussing all other issues, including the border. And it had, I think, several rounds, 24, 25 rounds, and it gradually became dysfunctional because this had more or less established what we call peace and tranquility of the border. Freeze things as they are. And then let's move into doing other things together. Even if there were minor incursions or ingressions, as we call by mistake, by the patrolling parties, they very often did not lead to any flare-up or anger on either side, because there was a larger understanding that we need not really patch up things between the two relations. Based on that, in 2005, they had upgraded that conversation to national security advisors on both sides, or the confidants of national leaders, who would not go through the bureaucratic rigmarole, but directly talk to the national leader, debrief and brief the national leader, and talk to themselves. This was a very interesting change in the format, because Chinese, right from day one, had said, let us try for a political package. And India had always been much more legalistic about, because we were inheriting the British system like you have. And we had gradual transfer of power, and we had adopted all the institutions, all the treaties, everything that the British had over the time. In fact, that is a unique thing about British imperialism around the world, that they have very, very gradually passed on the power to nations that they had colonized over the time. Unlike some other countries, European imperial powers, where they saw revolution, violent revolutions. So here again, because India had inherited everything that was British, India had inherited something in the east called McMahon Line, which was dividing Tibet and India, then became China and India, of course. So India's approach was always legalistic, but this is the moment when India and China decided to let us focus on political package. They didn't call it political package, they said political parameters. Then, of course, same year, the two foreign ministries also set up a working group called Mechanism on Consultation and Coordination. As the world is discussing now, the coming of President Xi Jinping has seen a new era, quote unquote. And in that new era, the era of Deng Xiaoping of bide your time and hide your strengths is over. China is claiming its space in international politics, in world affairs. And this period, among many other things, has seen enormous increase in what we call incursions. Military patrolling parties move on to the other side by mistake or intention. So both the intensity and frequency and the size, because meanwhile in 40 years, the Chinese side frontier areas infrastructure has improved. So also Indian side infrastructure has improved. So they can bring in heavy equipment much faster to the frontiers. So this last almost 8-9 years have seen that intensity, frequency, and the magnitude of these incursions is changing. So we had the first long-term tension eyeball-to-eyeball deployments in 2017 in Bhutan, which is a small kingdom in Himalayas, a very special relationship with India. Indian army trains their soldiers, provides advice in security and foreign affairs. So it became virtually a tension between China and India, 72 days eyeball-to-eyeball deployments. And then came the SCO summit in Sharma. And Xi Jinping wanted to make sure Indian Prime Minister attends it. And India wouldn't confirm it until 7 days to the summit meeting, which led to the breakthrough, and both sides backed off from there after 72 days. Likewise, again in Galwan last 2 years back, in June, there was another skirmish. And then, of course, since then, the four commanders have been talking to each other on the border, 16 talks, and they have, at 4 points, they have achieved military disengagement. And the first two were immediately achieved in 2020 only, because that's an area where India had enormous advantage and China agreed to disengage there, but China was not disengaging anywhere since then. Now, recently, 10 days back, after a long time, President Xi Jinping was to go and attend the summit in Uzbekistan. And that is where he would meet Indian Prime Minister. So 10 days before that, 2 more places disengagement was achieved, so that there's a positive ambience and people thought that 2 will meet at bilateral level. That did not happen. What are the emerging trajectories if this is the past? Let me very quickly say the fundamental thing that is determining the changing essential nature of the relationship is that both countries are no longer the same as they were. China is seen as rising China, India is called emerging India, and they are located in an extremely intertwined, interdependent, globalizing world. And in that sense, we notice that the synergies that are growing in their regional and global interface is showcasing a positive spin-off for bilateral relations. There is a stabilizing impact on bilateral relations. So if they are meeting at regional level and they're discussing pandemic or climate change or terrorism or all other transnational crime, etc., they have similar views on those issues, and that is creating a certain synergy at the regional and global level. And that has a positive spin-off on the bilateral. Now, for example, India again is a country which is a Quad member, Multilateral Security Framework, and in fact a major defense partner of United States. All the foundational agreements are signed with United States. But at the same time, India is also currently holding the presidency of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is a member of BRICS nations, and also currently chair of G20 nations. So India, in that sense, is in both sides of, if you like to see it as a divide which is emerging, where China, Russia, and some other countries are on one side, United States allies, and others are on the other side. India, in that sense, is in both kind of formations as of now. And even between China and India here, the impact is that pandemic saw both China and India going out and giving medicines to 100+ countries and vaccines later to likewise a large number of countries. But there's a very important link between China and India. 70% plus APIs, which is raw material for India's generic medicines, and India is called pharmacy of the world. I don't know if you've heard it. Is dependent on those ingredients that come from China in that sense. 24,000 Indian students are studying in China. And China is enormously sort of visible now in terms of its not just trade, but investments in power, telecommunications, roads, ports, consumer products, and much of India's e-commerce, of course. So therefore, what you have is a very conflicting picture. We had enormous tensions from 2020 because of border skirmish and deaths. But same year, the trade went up by 43%, keeping China as India's largest trading partner. So China and India China is the largest trading partner for India. It's interesting twist, and I must share that China's financial year is January to December. India's financial is April to March. So for 3 months, China was announced as the largest trading partner of India. And then when we calculated our financial year, United States with few $1 million had crossed it. So United States became the largest. So unlike Canada, for example, there is no comparison of Canada's trade with United States and China. But in case of India, the trade is neck to neck as to how much trade India does with the United States and how much trade India does with China. Looking at future trajectories and the change in quintessential nature of China-India, you can notice the size of economies. We understand that 20th century, the national power was primarily driven by military. In 21st century, there's a shift now. National power is primarily driven by your economic prowess. Or Joseph Nye, if you read him, talks about hard power, which is military power, now soft power, smart power, and sharp power. So you can notice that China and United States, I sometimes like to say that in 20th century, for example, the world was stable because both Soviet Union and United States together held about 70,000 nuclear weapons. 21st century needs to be perhaps stable because both China and India will have $20 trillion economies of the total about 100 plus trillion of the world. So these are two large economies. How they relate with each other is important. And India in that sense becomes significant because United States would like to see India becoming a countervailing power, which India is shy. But other than economy, if you look at defense expenditure, India is the third largest defense spender after United States and China. So in that sense, India's defense imports make India a very attractive market for all the Western nations, also for Russia. This is how the GDP has been changing in last 10 years. China shot up in 1990s and early 2000s, but in last 10 years, you can see India's position in the top 10 countries in terms of GDP has moved up from position 10 to position 5. And the first quarter of this year, India's GDP grew by 13.5%. That reminded me of 92-93 when Chinese economy had grown by 13%. And world was talking of overheating of Chinese economy. I remember Xinhua, Professor Zhou Rongqi was brought in as Prime Minister to simply ensure soft landing of Chinese economy. It was growing too hot. So 30 years later, it sees India is touching that same 13.5%. So you might see the projections that are made, depending on which year projections are talking about, India would be sooner or later the third largest economy after China, United States, and India in that sense. So that is going to really also change things. So let me quickly conclude. What I'm saying is Chinese economy currently, of course, is roughly 6 times larger than India. And if economic power is the real source of strength for a nation, China has enormous advantage. But India also has its own advantages, which need to be underlined. Unlike China, for example, India is extremely diverse. Imagine anything, religion, culture, ethnicity, art, language, anything. Enormous diversity compared to China. And since I described the relationship as a mosaic, India is much at home with those contradictions and managing those contradictions domestically and in foreign policy. And that is how India is able to be friendly with almost all major powers. Middle East is a great example. India is a very good friend of Israel, of UAE, of Iran, of Saudi Arabia, of Israel, countries that don't see eye to eye with each other. That is why United States last year, when it wanted to start another quad for the Middle East after Indo-Pacific, it added India. India, UAE, Israel, and United States, because India brings in that moderation and vantage point. Also, unlike China, I'm saying, it seems that India is not seen as posing challenge to United States leadership either in Asia Pacific or beyond in the world. Also, unlike China, India now definitely can claim to be much younger. So China reaped a lot of benefits when Chinese population was younger and it sort of shot up in terms of growth rates. We are hoping to replicate. We don't know if that will happen in India. So there is definitely a demographic advantage, and that is supposed to continue for at least next 2 to 3 decades. India's policy as a result of these strengths is one today, which is not non-alignment, but multi-alignment. It's like in China, you have moved from hide your strengths and bide your time to new era. In India now, we've moved away from non-alignment to multi-alignment, align as many countries in as many sectors as possible. So do that, keeping strategic autonomy, not making compromises in terms of the basics of Indian foreign policy. Maybe make tactical adjustments, but then make as many partnerships as possible. And I assume if you notice the new assertive nature of Indian foreign policy, that is both the cause and consequence, of course, of increasing acceptance of that kind of new posturing that India is doing. And that applies to China as well in that sense. And one can notice the Chinese often are willing to appreciate and engage India's sensitivities when push comes to shove. And I just gave an example of 2 summit meetings that happened where President Xi Jinping was to come face to Indian Prime Minister, and sudden breakthroughs happened on the part. And then, of course, they have enormous stakes in Indian market. Indian Prime Minister now likes to say India can easily accept up to $1.5 trillion of investments in India. You remember China was the largest market for foreign investments at some stage. Maybe it will get replicated in India in coming times. How that impacts China in their relation, I think that's very critical, because I started by saying what these 2 countries do domestically itself has enormous impact on the world, because they have 35% of global population is here. And then how much they undermine each other or partner with each other would maximize or minimize what they can contribute to the rest of the world together. And I think with that, I should say thank you very much for listening to me. And I now look forward if there are any questions or comments, and I would like to respond to those. Thank you.
Excellent. We have up to an hour for discussion, and these gatherings are all about discussion. I'm really excited to have some undergraduates here. You get to participate in the discussion. In fact, these events are designed to encourage you to participate. There's no such thing as a bad question. Yeah, with the length of time available, we can have follow-up questions and really dig into some of these issues. People on Zoom are welcome, in fact, encouraged to participate also. So I will start the ball rolling with a question about the reason why the border dispute persists. So let's put the issue of Kashmir aside and focus on the border in the Himalayas. Why does it persist? What is the national interest? Are we talking about much territory? Are we talking about resources? Is this just about national pride? Is it public opinion, or is it leadership viewpoints? Just from the little I know, it seems like a distraction from a far larger relationship where the interests in terms of cooperation should be paramount. Why does this persist?
Thank you. I think the border lies at the very center of how China-India relations are understood. And good that you asked me this question so that I can speak a little more on that subject. There are a lot of anecdotes, and I'm sure Brian would know, maybe repeating for him some of the anecdotes. There was a time of tensions on the border in 1962 when Indian Prime Minister was saying something in Parliament. I'm not sure how true, these are anecdotes. So some member of Parliament may have said that not a blade of grass grows on that, why are we getting our soldiers killed? So some other member said that not any hair grows on your head as well, so should we chop it off? And that's very symbolic. I said symbolisms and semantics are significant for civilizations. That shows that that part is seen as a head, and there is a goddess, Mother India. And if you look at the map of India, you often have maps with Mother Goddess wrapped in Indian sari, and that part on the top comes like as her head. So yes, it is emotional, it is pride, but let me also add that something what has allowed that narrative to sustain and survive. Both these societies, I can't call them even kingdoms because there were many kingdoms on both sides. So there was a scenic civilization and Indic civilization is what is definite. Otherwise, the territorial formations over a period of time were changing and they were never the one they are today. So these two societies had multiple kingdoms which had frontiers. They will wax and wane depending on the strength of the prince or the king on other side. And frontier areas, princelings or princes and kings could even pay obeisance to both sides. That flexibility. Now the territoriality comes to them because of imperialism, because of European nation states. They are the ones who are busy demarcating boundaries on the ground. And because both these nations, by the time they became independent or China was liberated, they saw themselves and they adopted themselves to be territorial nation states. And therefore, those territories are significant because countries that are subjugated for centuries are almost obsessed with asserting their sovereignty and independence. European nations, for example, took 50 years to merge their sovereignty partially. ASEAN has been trying to merge some parts of their sovereignty, have failed so far because they wanted to become a cultural community by 2015 and then economic and security community, nothing has happened. So nations are obsessed with their sovereignty, and if sovereignty is visualized in terms of territoriality, then let's say every inch of your territory, irrespective of what grows there or what minerals you find there, is irrelevant. And then, of course, these two also emerged as two different models in Asia. China as a communist country, India as a liberal democracy. India was being engaged by all the liberal democracies of the world as a model for Asia. And China and Comintern would like to present their model for Asia. So there was a little bit of contestation as to which country is a role model for other newly independent nations of that region. And I could go on speaking. For example, I mentioned to you, these are territories which are not easy to access. So no history, no easy geography. There are glaciers, there are tropical forests. Nobody lives in most of these areas other than small central sector, which also makes it extremely, so I say sometimes even if you make two friends sit down together and say, oh, you demarcate these boundaries, they won't be able to because it's not easy to actually go on ground and measure these things there. And last point, I am an academic, so geologically Himalayas are growing. It's an academic point. And geologically Himalayas are growing. So the riverbeds are changing. And therefore, if riverbeds are changing, it is constantly moving geography. It's a moving geography. How do you demarcate a European territorial nation state in that region? So there are these kind of issues that keep this alive. But over a period of time, they have developed certain understanding. So there are at least three definitely functional border trade points. So they describe these regions as border regions because there's no border. And so in the border regions, there are three trade points, which more or less makes them feel like, okay, this is some transaction happening here, and indirectly recognizing that this is where the border is, but not formally recognizing that. And then, of course, there were smaller kingdoms in that area. There was a smaller kingdom called Sikkim. It became part of India in 1975. They wanted to be part of India from 1940s only. There was a national movement in India led by Indian National Congress. There was a similar Indian National Congress in Sikkim. There was a likewise Nepalese Congress in Nepal. So some of those people who had also been pushing similar freedom struggle, they also wanted to join with it. But in 1947, they were not allowed to join. But Sikkim joined India in 1975. So there are those Himalayan kingdoms also. So again, makes it very curious as to For a long time, till 2005 or 2003, actually, China did not recognize that Sikkim had joined India. Then in 2005, it recognized Sikkim has joined India, Sikkim is part of India. So those are complex issues, but fundamentally, more relaxed these two countries become about their nationhood, more confident they become about themselves, lesser these issues perhaps would trouble their relationship. And that is why over a period of time, the focus has shifted to peace and tranquility. But now again, we see that both nations are suddenly getting a little bit more tension on the border because there's a sudden shift in their worldview. Neo-era China, some Westerners like to call now there's a Wolf warrior diplomacy from China, and a relatively assertive India as well. So that again, so they have to shift gear now. They have lived long enough in that peace and tranquility chapter. Now they are new nations, they are new powers, very different in terms of their world. They need to find new mechanisms to ensure stability in their bilateral relationship, in which border would be the most significant to stabilize. Thank you, Michael, for allowing me to expand on that core area.
It's fascinating. In addition to the border crossings, there was a wonderful article in the New Yorker magazine a couple of years ago concerning an astronomical observatory that is in the disputed zone that actually brings Indian and Chinese scientists together. So there are elements of cooperation, which I think just speaks to the complexity of the situation. Other questions, comments?
We've got a question from the Zoom chat.
Yes, please.
Okay, so you should be good to unmute and ask a question now.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Professor Swaran, for your wonderful talk. I have one question and one point to clarify. So the question is basically about the Galwan crisis. And I was working on a project under the APLN, which basically is looking at the India, Pakistan, China nuclear trilemma. And my reading suggested that there were concerns in India after Galwan because it was the first crisis where India had actually lost 20 soldiers in like after 1962 border war with India, with China. This was the first time when there were so many human casualties. And there were concerns that this is going to play into India's domestic political scene. India-China relationship, as far as I understand, have never been an electoral issue in a real sense. But do you think Galwan has changed that? And do you think it's going to now factor into India's domestic politics? And just the second point, where I just want a bit of clarification, is that you mentioned a Kashmir dispute and Escalation, and you said like it's not just a bilateral dispute, but our understanding in Pakistan is that India-Pakistan have talked about Kashmir at several occasions as a dispute between the two, and part of it is that it's not just a territorial dispute; it's more than territorial, which means that there is a serious human issue involved there. So, what would you say to that? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And first of all, my sympathies for flood victims in Pakistan.
Thank you.
I hope they are getting relief, better settlements are happening. I agree with you on Kashmir also being the issue of peoples. But we live in nation-state system, and very often nations take decisions about territories at the national scale level. And very often, let's say the border communities are not the prime advisors as to how those regions' future will be determined. To some extent, yes, it is, but very often nations take decisions looking upon how they want to engage with each other. And I understand sometimes the voices of those people may not get as much weight or space as they should. But because I was underlining the territoriality of nation state, that territoriality territoriality remains still significant in the marketing territories between India, China, and Pakistan in that sense. To your question, whether Galwan would make tensions on the border an election issue, may not be specifically this one issue, but I'm sure you have followed the trends in Indian domestic politics to see that almost for 20 plus years, in fact, one could go back to the middle of 1990s, when for the first time foreign policy started becoming a factor in domestic elections. So it's been a gradual progression. I think that happens to any rising power. That over a period of time, because much of its energy, attention, and focus expands beyond domestic issues and it engages region and the world, in any emerging power, therefore, the foreign policy issues over a period of time will become significant at domestic level in domestic elections. And same has happened in India in the last 25 years. For example, India's nuclear tests of 1998 were significant issues in domestic politics. Not that they made the party win elections, that's a separate matter, but they were issues in domestic elections. And likewise, India's foreign policy is over a period of time becoming a matter of debate in Indian domestic politics. In that vein, in that sense, I think China would become part of debates on Indian elections and how leaders address those issues. But India, as you know, sorry to digress slightly, is a federation, and of course we have also grassroots elections. So sometimes we joke that India is perennially on elections. There are always some other elections going on in India, either at the grassroots level or at the provincial level or at the national level. And all provinces, 30 plus provinces, they have their different schedules for elections. So sometimes we say that Indian politicians have to really sweat themselves hard because country has some or the other elections going on all the time. So in many of those, other than national elections, I wouldn't think foreign policy is as yet a significant issue. Thank you for your comment and question.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. So, any other questions? Yes, please.
I do have a question, kind of a follow-up on what you asked. For one of the, either India or China to back down from the border dispute and give up the land, which seems unlikely given that it's decades of conflict, what do they have to lose there? Would they gain a better relationship, or would it not improve at all and they just simply have lost land that they've spent already so much time?
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting question. They can be pragmatic. China is popular around the world for being pragmatic about issues. The way Hong Kong was taken back, by allowing Hong Kong a separate flag, separate currency, separate police. Mainland Chinese, I think, still need a permit to go there. So China is known to be pragmatic. Why can't they be pragmatic? That's a valid question to ask. But point is, when you have a complex rivalry over a period of time, then one is not sure even, I'm not saying that's possibility, but let's say we are living in an ideal world. One of the country gives the territory to the other. I'm not sure if the relationship will suddenly become friendly, because then they will find some other issue to have that irritation. And right now, I'm saying border is most significant, quintessential, but there are other issues of tensions. For example, China's relations with Pakistan are an issue. China very often taking a very different view on what India think, much of the world thinks are terrorists in Pakistan. China is not allowing India to become member of nuclear suppliers group. So there are multiple other issues. The border is apparently the longest surviving. In fact, this is the longest disputed border on planet Earth right now. So that makes it significant. But it's not that supposing suddenly you imagine that issue is gone, that there is no more any rivalry in these two countries. But of course, that remains extremely difficult. People in India, as I was just saying, are perennially in elections. So very often we think that perhaps China has leaders with one party rule. They can take such bold decision to give the land to India. But Chinese also repeatedly keep saying on this response to this that they have to worry about their public opinion. So narratives have been built over a period of time on both sides. Generations have been sort of fed on these imaginations of what is the Chinese man, what is the Indian man. So it's not going to be a popular decision for either side. In India, I said it's very nearly in elections. It's not going to be acceptable decision that the picture I showed you of a prime minister, who's, as I said, was a mentor of the current prime minister, he had said something which was unusually bold itself, saying that perhaps we could think of freezing borders as they are. And that itself was, I think, inordinately out of box. Very bold thing to say, that we would not take the territories we claim. But he had indicated that maybe we could explore possibilities. We will be sort of deploying enormous amount of forces in these high altitude areas, where sometimes weather is more dangerous than the enemy. Why can't we just freeze and forget? Americans have this popular phrase, fire and forget. So we said, let's freeze and forget these areas. But narratives are so strong on both sides. Histories have been written. It's not easy choice on either side. I think the sensible choice which they made, and that's survived for last 3-4 decades, is to not ratchet up that issue, let it be peaceful, and peace and tranquility chapter, I said, was what was focus. They created many mechanisms to ensure that peace and tranquility is the focus. Resolving is next step. But meanwhile, both China and India have changed completely. Very different countries what they were in early 1990s. Early 1990s, both China and India had GDP of $300 billion. Chinese were about $15 billion more than India. About 297, Chinese were 312. That is the GDP of Pakistan. Today, China's GDP is counted anywhere between 16 trillion to 19 trillion dollars. India is $3.2 trillion. So these are large economies, and they're sort of completely transformed themselves over a period of time. And therefore, the old template of how to make peace and tranquility in the border is becoming kind of under stress. That's why the tension continues, and that doesn't make it likely that any side will say, okay, you take it. That's not likely to happen.
Quick follow-up question on that. Do you see any risk of escalation? I mean, could a border skirmish lead to a full-out war between India and China? Or is there a sense that both countries are managing this?
I think, thank you, Michael. These are questions that make me expand on things I would have said. One could give a semester-long course on this issue. I have always prided myself, and I need to celebrate all that happens between China and India line of actual control. You see soldiers pushing each other. Worst case scenario, throwing stones, making videos of each other while fighting, pushing each other. Now, these are one of the best armed forces around the world. They both have nuclear weapons. They are the largest armed forces. I just showed you China is the second largest defense budget. India is third largest defense budget. They have enormous capability. And then you see on the border restrained to such low levels of pushing and shoving is a matter of pride in that sense. How both sides, not just the top leadership, but on the ground soldiers have been trained to ensure restraint. I think that gives also confidence that perhaps chances of escalation is not likely, because that is the track record so far. But academics also often tell you that when both sides have enormous capacity to escalate, go back to Henry Kissinger, nuclear weapons and foreign policy of 1950s, and since then many people have said this, what is called escalation de-escalation metrics, where you have enormous capacity to bring to bear in terms of violence, then violence shifts from the higher echelons to lower levels. So you would use low intensity conflict because you cannot afford that enormous amount of violence where things could go completely out of control. And so therefore, you can notice now whether it is India, Pakistan or India, China, most of expression of tension through violence is at lowest rung of the possible violence. They don't want to escalate it. They don't think they can afford to escalate it. So in that sense, both in terms of how theories have spoken about how violence operates in terms of metrics when you have nuclear weapons on both sides, or how national leaders have taken decisions of ensuring that peace and tranquility is maintained on the border, and how soldiers on the ground behave, are in line in that sense of ensuring that despite enormous dispute on large size of territory, it's only so far pushing and shoving. It's somewhere around Chu Valley, there was 86, 87 when some people died, and now in Galwan some people died, or in 1962. When you talk of 2.2 million soldiers on Chinese side and 1.2 million soldiers on Indian side, you could think of very dangerous possibilities. So I think if one has to simply look at their track record, restraint will be maintained on this issue, I assume.
Other questions? Yes, please.
We've got one from Professor Tabergian on Zoom. If you'd like to unmute.
All right. Hello, Swaran. Sorry for missing the start of the talk. Yeah, that's fascinating as always. Thank you for those amazing insights. So I wanted to shift to the global political economy. And if we just freeze on 2022 for India, especially since April and May, something extraordinary has happened, right? We have seen the spectacle of India attending a BRICS summit only to fly to G7 plus meeting, being at the Quad and then Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. On Ukraine, berating now Putin at SCO, but not agreeing to sanctions and not joining the G7 in the global sanctions and buying more oil and actually making money of it. Then the events in Pakistan and Sri Lanka so dramatic, not as bad in India for climate, but Pakistan and Sri Lanka in terrible positions. So with all this happening, does it force India towards some more debates on its global identity, or does it just comfort the idea that India can be everywhere at the same time and have this multi-dimensional identity and role in global affairs? And is in this moment when India is becoming actually a systemic player, right? I think we are living through the moment when India is shifting from a regional player to a systemic one, along with US, US, China, EU, maybe Russia. And of course, India will chair the G20 next year. So do we see a change in discourse, change in identity, change in interests that accompanies such a moment of transition? What do you think?
Thank you, Yves. I'm aware that you are so familiar with Asian affairs and India. You're also generous in your comments. I agree with you mostly what you said, but there is no doubt there's enormous challenge in, as you said, trying to be everywhere. That's not an easy choice to make. And there are costs attached to such a choice. When you are a part of one group, there is perhaps greater confidence among the group members about your loyalty to the group compared to when you are a member of multiple groups. So you have to work hard to earn that credibility with those members. So I understand there are challenges and sometimes there are costs. You mentioned Ukraine crisis. I understand United States is not happy with India and the way India has conducted itself on Ukraine crisis. But compared to China, for example, India definitely is managing both sides much better. China has taken its side very clearly, that it is with Russia, even if it is angry with Russia. But India has stood with both sides in the name of what I call proactive neutrality, where it makes a distinction whether it is in Afghanistan or Ukraine, that India will not wait until the top leaders have come home and started talking and resolve issues and allow populations to suffer on the ground. So both in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, and like many other countries, India is providing humanitarian assistance. I think by now 12 consignments have gone to Ukraine, totaling about 100 tons of medicines and other things. Whereas India also constantly talks to both Zelensky, Putin, and of course Joe Biden. So it is trying to make sure if it can influence. And there were a lot of speculations actually in Uzbekistan that whether Indian Prime Minister will meet Russian President. There was also speculations of Indian Prime Minister meeting Chinese President. All that the Ministry of External Affairs was saying until the very last hour, that Indian Prime Minister will meet the host nation, Uzbek President, and some other leaders. And of course, Indian Prime Minister met finally President Vladimir Putin. And you are aware that he mentioned, among other things, that war is not a good option in today's times, which was clearly trying to balance between what United States would like to hear and what President Putin would like to see India sort of reasserting, reaffirming the partnership and confidence that we have in each other. So it's a tough choice to make, but it goes back to my last point to respond to you will be to Indian ethos. You know, you're familiar with the several phrases like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. India civilizationally has looked at world as a family. And in family, you can't choose which brother or sister or uncle you will be siding with. You're with everybody. It has its challenges, but that is where that sense flows. And I mentioned India has shifted from non-alignment, which was limited to not aligning with military alliances, but aligning with other areas, to now clear policy of multi-alignments, of building as many partnerships in as many sectors with as many countries as possible. And I think we appreciate that the whole world is moving in that direction, where relations which are transactional are not necessarily seen as negative. You could be an alliance partner, that's a good relationship, but you could have transactions. And I think Chinese have contributed to that kind of change at global level enormously. You see enormous investments and trade with Taiwan or Japan, which are difficult entities for Beijing to deal with, has transformed that you could have kind of multi-vectors, as we say, foreign policy engagements. And India is doing that, keeping an eye on what I call strategic autonomy. That ultimately, it only pursues Indian national interests, following principles of foreign policy that India values. But very often, if you see India making tactical maneuvers, that is a novelty, and that's complex conduct of foreign policy. But I think so far it has worked. It has received greater acceptance around the world. Among all major powers, India is, as you mentioned, sitting in BRICS and SCO, and also sitting in Quad and G7, as you mentioned. I think that's a recognition of India's new relevance, acceptance, and possibly remit. I'm happy you called India as a system shaping or system influencing country in the making, shall we say. And that means that Indian foreign policy is not doing too bad right now. Thank you, Yves, for joining this discussion. Yves is the professor I knew for decades before I came to UBC. And I think he definitely was one attraction to join a political science department.
Thank you, Swaran. I had a very short follow-up is, can you say a couple more things on IPEF? You know, from the American perspective, define the fact that India is withdrawing from the IPEF trade pillar and then the digital pillar that's under trade, right, is a big loss, right? So can you explain more why this is happening, what is driving? And then maybe on the SCO meeting, I understand there was no meeting with Xi Jinping, right? Between Modi and Xi Jinping, but was there one with Erdogan? What were some of the other interesting bilaterals that may have happened with India?
Thank you. I think we could spend long time debating on each of these bilaterals, but let me first address the first question you asked. But let me also say that two foreign ministers of India and China had met beforehand, and that had led to speculations which were reinforced by the fact that there was one more military disengagement in Hot Springs, one point on the western sector of the border, just a couple of days before the summit meeting. And that really strengthened these possibilities of Indian plans meeting President Xi Jinping. But possibly they did not find any great clincher or takeaway. And therefore, the fact that 20th Party Congress is so close now, I don't think President Xi Jinping would have wanted a meeting when he doesn't have a takeaway from there. Or Indian Prime Minister would have wanted a meeting when they don't have a takeaway to go home and say, this is how we have kind of achieved some breakthrough in that meeting. Meeting with Erdogan, I think, was interesting, apart from other routine meetings, since you also mentioned it. You would remember that Turkey, Malaysia, Pakistan have been kind of not the most friendly countries, shall we say, to India. And in that sense, engaging President Erdogan was a good initiative on the Prime Minister's side. Particularly so because if one country that has really been much effective in dealing with Ukraine crisis, it's Turkey. Turkey has, ensured the opening up of Black Sea ports for grain exports, and in that sense, making two sides talk to ensure that those shipments will not be hurt, has seen Turkey gain a certain, sort of respect in how to deal with the Ukraine crisis. And I think both in terms of how Turkey is working in Ukraine crisis, that could be a common point for India and Turkey to sit down and talk. But also how Turkey has overall looked at, engaging Pakistan, Malaysia, doing and saying things which are not most comfortable to India. That could be another way of looking at how Indian Prime Minister's meeting with President of Turkey was significant. I think I missed, you had another point I almost forgot that.
That was IPEF.
Yes, thank you. India is very sensitive and perhaps of a view that some of these regional orders, when they become prisoners to great power politics, India is uncomfortable with that. So in that sense, as long as, for example, our CEP was an ASEAN initiative, India was totally engaged with that, but over a period of time, we saw it became more or less like China-led initiative. And of course, we had a practical problem of enormous deficit with China and 11 of other countries. India has deficit with. So India decided its interests are not really being considered in our CEP, and India decided to walk out. And likewise, India joined the IPEF also this May. But because it was supposed to be much more a framework, it was not supposed to be a trade agreement, not a free trade agreement. Nothing about lowering tariffs or dispute settlement or market access, nothing of that. But basically it was focusing how to trade rather than what to trade. So in that best standards, that templates being built and best practices being shared, etc. That was perhaps the focus. But now it seems it is moving in direction which is bringing it closer to kind of a free trade arrangement. And so another thing I must say is that India has not walked out of IPEF as sometimes press is making. India simply refused to sign on declaration in the trade pillar negotiations. So it technically has not even walked out of trade pillar as sometimes we are saying. It just didn't sign that declaration. And now increasingly, IPF also begins to look like, US led, and US is in a hurry apparently. They want to announce a completion of IPF by, APEC meeting that they're hosting next year in November. So that push, hurry about doing things on the ground. is making it look like again power driven, and great power contestation is something India wants to stay away from. So you have RCEP led by China, US is out of it. And you have now IPEF led by United States, China is out of it. Is not something that India finds itself very comfortable, as I mentioned, to take sides. And the moment these organizations begin to look like part of big power contestation, India begins to show its discomfort. So that is how I think you can notice the response of reluctance. I wouldn't say walking out, reluctance is becoming much more visible in case of IPEF. Thank you, Yves, for staying on with us.
Was there a question over here?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So among the timeline that you showed us, that actually caught my eyes that like 1988 there was a border dispute, and also 25 there was also another like border talk. That kind of reminds me of when the SARC made in 1885. So what was fascinating on my studying was that China actually became one of those observer country of SARC in 2005 when exactly the representative border talks happened. So I'm just wondering if there was any like intervention, domestic dispute, like affairs went on from China to India.
I didn't get this point.
So
Last part,
oh, so like was there any like
domestic.
the interference in domestic affairs from China to
China?
India? Yeah.
Into Indian domestic.
In
affairs.
India, yes, in a political way. Because to me, it seems like China is trying to make some like suppress to Indian policy, because I think the 2 decades, it was enough for China to see those SARC success. How like
You
the
mean in the
Southeastern-
SARC,
Yeah.
not domestic to Indian politics, but inside
in
SARC.
SARC in general,
Okay.
yeah. So maybe
Thank you.
like China wants.
So
to-
not like Australia.
Oh,
Australia
no,
had to pass legislations.
no. I just want to like ask, especially China, because of the how close they are at
Yes,
compared to other like observer countries.
sure.
So
No, there's no doubt China is the most influential, indulgent. The Chinese are very fond of giving a lot of gifts to delegates and signing checks of enormous amounts. So among observer nations, I would say definitely China is not only the closest in terms of proximity, but also most influential among observers, observers of SARC. So much so that many SARC members had started campaigning that China should be given full membership. But what you mentioned of 2005 is interesting, because 2003 to 5, we had excellent bonhomie between the two sides. And that is why Sikkim was recognized as part of India. We started upgrading the talks from official level to special representatives level. So in that context of mutual bonhomie, India was comfortable to let China come and become an observer in SARC organization. And SARC over a period of time has become self-confident. That now we can open up to others also. But SARC itself has become dysfunctional for almost now 6 years, 2016 onwards. So there are no summit meetings. Again, let me qualify. SARC has become dysfunctional only in terms of not holding summit meetings. SARC has a whole lot of other mechanisms, levels, institutions, centers. They are functioning as normal. There's a SARC secretariat in Kathmandu, Nepal. There are, for example, India has a SARC university. Likewise, Pakistan has. Each of these countries have some sector on which they focus on. India focuses on education. So those things are functioning perfectly fine. So China, definitely, I agree with you, is most influential inside SARC. I had misunderstood briefly that perhaps you meant Indian domestic politics. I don't see China in that sense play influencing Indian domestic politics. Indian domestic politics perhaps is too complex for Chinese to understand. There are too many political parties, there are too many regional, national, provincial voices, they have different agendas and different focus. Even, I think we have 450 plus political parties in the country. Chinese are used to mostly 1 plus 9 as window shopping. So it's a complex kind of politics. And I'm not undermining that Chinese can influence other countries' domestic politics. They can do it to United States. They can definitely do it to India. But so far, I'm not aware that they have influenced domestic political trends. But in SAARC, yes, definitely they were the most influential observer.
Brian.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the talk. Thank you. I would follow on Steve's line of questioning and ask you about what the worldview that you see developing for India fits within the context of what we're seeing from China. Because if one looks at China, however you wish to characterize it at the moment, you would see it growing, its growing spheres of influence in Africa, in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and also probably now in Russia. Where does an Indian view of where the world's going fit within the context of what appears to be a much, much more expansive and wider sphere of influence for China? And saying that it feels, it feels at home with the United States doesn't seem to me to be an answer to that particular dilemma. The notion of having strategic autonomy seems to me to be a luxury if one looks forward into a future.
Sure. That's why I mentioned making tactical adjustments. Strategic autonomy subject to tactical adjustments. But in long run, of course, pursuing strategic autonomy. What is interesting is, again, India, like any civilizational state, is grounded, the foreign policy is grounded in civilizational DNA in that sense. And in that civilizational DNA, the focus has always been people. Even in 1950s, when India was not as capable, India had started an international technical and economic cooperation program and going to Africa and the Asian countries, basically focusing on skill building. Now we have a full ministry of skill building, of course. So capacity building, knowledge sharing, technology sharing, and that is why partly India is better in services than in manufacturing. So that remains the kind of broad bandwidth within which Indian foreign policy engages itself. So the worldview where you mentioned China has a worldview and India has a worldview. I would say India's worldview perhaps in that sense comes closer to United States and European Union and Canada, which is where normative foreign policy is, particularly EU and Canada would see that normative foreign policy is a significant driver of actual relations. India would come closer to these. So what is the worldview of China? China is trying to use what it has, and it has enormous deep pockets. That is the big leverage China has. And economic incentives, as Joseph Nye says, are very attractive in that sense. So even G7 countries like Italy would fall into that and accept that, and of course Russia. Since Africa is going to be the future, demographic trends and of course growth rate trends is where Africa is the future. It's going to go up to 4 billion ultimately from 1.5 billion. So Chinese understand that and they're investing into future in that sense in Africa. But Chinese investments, because they are spreading so rapidly, are, sorry to say, largely commercial. They are not as much able to build constituencies on the ground level. They are very good in boardrooms. They're very good with national leaders, but they are not very often as good with the people on street. They are gradually working on that. I'm not saying they are not at all working on that, but compared to that, India has always focused on people on the ground. So India has, for example, enormous focus on cultural linkages. So Indian Prime Minister, where he's going to religious places, he's going to cultural places, he's underlining Buddhist links, or diaspora. India is now that's a very interesting thing. Other than Canada, it could be a slight exception here. But mostly Indian diaspora is enamored with India. I'm not too sure about Chinese diaspora being enamored with the politics in China. And Indian Prime Minister uses that to help. Whether he goes to United States or any other country, he makes sure he has a special interaction with the Indian community there. And I think that shows greater acceptability of those people of Indian diaspora, even in the host countries, wherever they are living. And you can notice that in various official organizations around the world, which is where your economic leverages work, you would have Chinese origin, ethnic Chinese are leading those. But in open market private sectors, where your skill and capacity works and your being good and qualified works, you see Indian ethnic Indians are leading all those corporations. So it's a different kind of world view and different kind of outcomes of that in terms of engagement. But fundamental difference is that apparently the current dominant, I wouldn't call it mainstream, the current dominant part of the world finds greater comfort in engaging Indian worldview with all the differences. Ukraine is an example, than with the Chinese. And that in that sense multiplies the outcome of Indian engagements in foreign policy. Thank you, Brian, for coming. I'm honored to see you in my room where I'm speaking. Thank you for your question. I hope I made some sense in this one.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Another question. Yes, please. Question. So it's actually more about assumption. So do you think in the future, when the day that India GDP surpasses China's, and let's assume United States is the top one, do you think that India be viewed as a threat to the international order or to the states when India kind of surpasses China GDP? When India is at China's position, how do you think the world will India?
Thank you. I am extremely happy to hear you say that, but you are the first person to say that. Nobody has said India will cross China's GDP. Most projections are that China will cross United States, and ultimately India will cross United States. So it will be China, India, and United States as three large economies. But happy to know you think India could cross China.
Well, because China has a population crisis, and also it's and I think China is currently having economic crisis due to its COVID policies. So
Could happen.
yes, so India actually has a kind of great potential to surpass China.
Good. So this is the post-pandemic thinking. I'm happy to hear that.
So, well, I'm not sure if China can surpass the States, but I think if we look long enough, there's a certain possibility that India will surpass China. It's just possibility.
It could always happen.
Yeah.
But if you go back to history until Industrial Revolution, then we were all agrarian societies. Even then, China and India were virtually producing half of the global GDP. Even then, China's GDP was bigger. And India today is not the Indic, it's not subcontinental India. Bangladesh has come out of it, Pakistan has come out. It could happen that India's GDP could cross China's, but it's an uphill task, it's a tough task. But what I am going to say is that already China's rise has transformed China. Sometimes we say that if Chairman Mao was to wake up and visit China, he won't recognize which country he is in. China has changed. Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. Thanks. So in case China actually becomes the world's largest economy, China may not be same China as it was. Because very often we say when politicians are in opposition, they behave very differently compared to when they come in power. So when China becomes the largest economy of the world, there are going to be very different expectations of China from the world and of the world from China. For example, right now, United States is maintaining about 40% of global defense expenditure, just one country. Can China replicate it? Can China also start spending that much money on defense? Or how else it will manage the relationship differently? So who will be the world policeman? US sometimes think they are the world policeman. And within that order is how Chinese have taken advantage of going all the way up. When they become in charge of the system, then there are costs attached to being the boss. Now, costs are not just financial costs. Costs are also going to be behavioral adjustments. You see already how much free market economy operates in China. Privately owned companies are the fastest growing companies in China. Different estimates talk about 27% of GDP is now in private hands in China. Now, Mao would be startled, he would be shocked to see this happening to his China. So that way, constantly, China will also evolve over a period of time. And the world is getting so intertwined now over a period of time that no country will be able to really push a policy which is not just not acceptable at home, but not acceptable to outside world. My last point, and sometimes I joke about it, that for United States presidential elections, the whole world should be the voting college. Because whosoever sits in White House has an impact not only in United States, but impact around the world. So why not everybody around the world should vote who will become the president of the United States? So in that sense, if China becomes the largest economy, which is very likely now, I heard yesterday somebody was saying as soon as 2025. I don't know. Especially the third term, Xi Jinping will make sure Taiwan joins China. So you get 1 more trillion added. So that will make it faster for China to cross. Post-pandemic growth rates are different. So 2025 is the earliest data I have. But it will fundamentally change China to a great extent. So it may not. Sometimes, the last joke for young people. When we are all young, we are leaving home for college. You have so many plans to do things that you were not allowed by parents. But when you go there, the socialization on you is so strong that you don't end up doing most of those things that you thought you will do when you're out of home. So likewise, Chinese sometimes think they will do things when they become the boss. But when you actually become the boss, then maybe you don't think that those are wise decisions to follow. Definitely some change will happen, is already happening. China is a great alternative for much of the world today in terms of trade and investment, which was not there ever. China is going out and investing, building huge projects. Sometimes Europeans were doing similar things to Asian countries, building airports, ports, hospitals, railway stations. Now China is doing that. So some impact definitely is going to be. For example, I'm told in Africa, million people are learning Chinese every year. So Chinese language is becoming popular. Language also brings rights and rituals and culture and poetry and everything comes along with language. Sorry, I want to stop here. Otherwise,
I'm curious, when China becomes the largest economy, will you begin to say that we should? And the reason I ask that is, of course, there is a very important difference between the United States and China, in that the United States is, to some degree, significantly still a democracy.
It's multi-party,
and China most definitely is not. That in itself would be a major shift.
There's no doubt. Logically, anyone that becomes global leader and has impact like tonight, I frankly don't. Now you're asking me to go in a slightly different direction, because I also always say China's rise is only limited to economic bandwidth. The richest student in class is not necessarily the brightest and most beautiful. Sorry, I'm being almost chauvinistic when I'm using these words.
Not to say brightest.
Just to save time. So China is going to become world's largest economy. Does not mean that it will become world leader. In fact, again, go back to Henry Kissinger, his World Order book of leadership, the latest book. He believes US will always be the world leader because it attracts the best brains from everywhere. West Chinese, West Indian, West Canadian are all in the United States. I'm caricaturing almost. I respect my opinion enormously. So if that is the model, then United States will stay on the move. It has only moved away from manufacturing to services. Now to R&D. It is doing things that others are not even thinking of doing. Of course, China is catching up much faster than earlier. Every next year they are coming closer. But economic rise may not mean that the world begins to recognize China as the world. Some part of the world definitely will recognize China as the world. But United States so far apparently the only comparison closest is the peak of British imperialism. When Queen decided the fashion trends around the world. There were no elections, of course, for the Queen. And US presidents, there is no other comparison of any other leader who can hold that kind of sway with all the criticism, with all the people who are angry with the United States. The kind of sway that American president still, after the recent two presidencies, this and last one, no other leader has that. I'm not as yet able to see a Chinese leader getting that kind of global sway. It is all the Chinese students want to go to Canada, Australia, United States. All the elite students of these countries go to the United States to learn. You know, last point, sorry, Mike. To quote the authority on the subject. There is a professor Wang Qishan, and if you heard his name, when I was 20 years back in Beijing University, he was the Dean of Social School of International Studies. He's possibly advisor on One Belt One Road. Big name, Wang Qishan. Month and a half ago, he had an interview in New York Times. And he said, as long as there are going to be long queues outside American embassies around the world for asking for visa, all this talk about relative decline of the United States is useless.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You look how small the Russian economy is, but Vladimir Putin is still a principal actor in international politics. He is driving the agenda with a tiny economy relative to other countries. This has all been fantastic. Thank you. We'll be doing another one of these in 15 days' time, so 2 weeks and a day. The notice will go out, but really excited to have undergraduates and graduate students here. So please encourage your fellow students to come. This really is an open space for you, a chance to interact.
Yeah, I sit in the same room where Max sits once in a while. You have my email in case any of you wish to see. Thank you, Max. Meeting you second time today.
Yeah, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone on Zoom as well. Thank you.